right, so let's open it up for questions. So I'm going to take groups, and I'll also let Birte, you'll have to stay quiet just for a little while longer, and we'll take questions from you. So I'll take the first four. So over here, and two in the back. So you, please. Could you please identify yourself?
I'm World Vision Program Manager for GSC project in Zimbabwe. It's more like an observation. For me, a surprise was that out of so many interventions, only two, I think, got green light that we know that they are working. But all the projects that were reviewed, they undoubtedly collected lots and lots of information. The question is, how relevant information has been collected to answering questions about impact? And from my own experience of working on GSC project, I don't know how much you know, it's the Education Challenge Fund data project, that we are asked to collect, I think, tons and tons and tons of information. We do our baseline, we do midline, now we're planning end line. And we're following the same cohorts, 3,000 girls from day one to completion of the project, and now we have opportunity to extend in under transition window and so on. So enormous wealth of data has been collected. And for us as an NGO sector, I think it's been a learning curve from here up to here. For when I started all this,
yeah, if we can wind up, please.
So I think there needs to be a closer cooperation between NGOs and research outlets, so that you can help us from day one to formulate questions that we need to seek answers, and then it would demonstrate the impact of our work. At the moment, we are pushed to be researchers as well as implementers of the project.
Okay.
And that's sort of, we are specialists in our field, so can we just support each other?
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Manny from RTI, and I got on this room. I think his work is just incredibly valuable and just a fantastic resource, despite what my question is going to be. Which is that there are certain types of interventions or ways we can be spending our time, such as strengthening education systems, which are not amenable to environmental evaluation and systematic reviews. And there's a concern that when you publish this kind of review, you bias people to conduct, carrying out conditional cash transfers rather than doing this, which might be more valuable. So I guess my question is, should evidence of that kind be brought into these kind of reviews, and if so, how?
Thank you.
My name is Thomas de Hoop, Senior Researcher at American Institutes for Research. What struck me, in addition to the results findings that Birte presented, is that even for the most successful interventions, the structured pedagogy approaches, the effect sizes are really small still. If you look at them, like for many of the indicators, they are lower than 0.2 standardized mean differences. And I don't think this is a cheap intervention. So my question is also, and I know you cannot answer that question, whether it's a cost-effective intervention that needs to be taken into consideration in the primary research more often. But in addition to that, it also strikes me as like maybe the challenge of resolving the learning crisis that we're currently having is even more challenging than we were already thinking on the basis of this systematic review. And particularly if even the most effective intervention still shows such small effect sizes.
I'm Pauline Rose from the University of Cambridge. Again, congratulations on such a systematic and thorough review. Two quick reflections, I think, on where we might go from here. The first is that if anyone in this room is doing research of this kind, then please make sure you're putting inequality in the centre of what you're doing. I think it's shocking that of all those studies, you couldn't come up with a sort of conclusion around that because the evidence just wasn't there. And I think that's just unforgivable for those of us that are doing research. So I think that's something we need to do differently. The second is about that we need to also stop separating access and learning. I'm just going to give a quick experience also from the Girls' Education Challenge. We are working very closely at the University of Cambridge with CAMFED. For those of you who don't know, CAMFED is a really great NGO working on girls' education, in particular in supporting girls, marginalised girls in secondary school. And I think the important finding there that probably hasn't made it into the review because it's too recent, again from the Girls' Education Challenge, is that yes, the bursaries are important in terms of reducing dropout and getting the young women into school, but that needs to be combined with the pedagogical, so it's not either or. And so when you've got the two together, then you have massive learning effects. So you see that 30% more of these marginalised girls are both staying in school and learning. So I think that's one of the big lessons that comes out of the review, but we also need more studies to understand that, and of course, importantly, in a cost-effective way. Thank you.
Okay, one more question, then we'll turn it over.
Hi, Rob Dubisky with Birte. When you looked at the implementations, were you able to rank the quality of the implementation and assess whether the intervention failed because it was a bad intervention or whether it was a bad implementation? We talked about computers in closets and books being locked up, and that to me is a failed implementation. Were you able to rank or assess somehow qualitatively whether the implementation was good so that people can look at it and say, well, good idea, bad implementation?
Okay.
Versus just bad idea. Thank you.
Thanks. So we're going to take another round, but first let me turn it over now, Birte, to you, but also invite some of the panelists. And I think there were some that were comments. You're welcome to comment on that. But there were 3 questions in particular that I'd like you to address. And one is this question of evaluating systems as opposed to individual interventions. Another is cost effectiveness. And the third is this implementation question. So, Birte.
The question about evidence and bringing in different types of evidence, I think it's partially related to some of the previous discussions about how we get this evidence used. I think what we're not saying is that a decision should be based solely on this systematic review. It should be, but it should be a source for making decisions. So, yes, other types of evidence should also be brought into the debate. When it comes to the issue of the size of the effect, I think, so this is something that we were also a bit surprised by and a bit disappointed, to be honest. I think part of the reason might be that, you know, in many of the contexts where these programs are implemented, the baseline is so low and the challenges are so big that just addressing a small part of the problem is not going to give you the large effects that we need. And I guess that's why one of our interpretations of what we find is that actually we need to address multiple barriers. And then the final question. Oh, implementation. So I think, unfortunately, the implementation evidence is not good enough to be able to do some kind of ranking. We tried, and we tried to kind of collect it as systematically as possible, and we looked at, so, you know, if you see in the full report, we have the forest plots where we have the results from all the different programs for a particular intervention area. And so we try to looking at, okay, what do we know about the implementation and what do we know about the results. We also used, we kind of developed program theories for different programs. So we tried to combine that as best we could to try to figure out whether it's implementation or poorly designed programs. But I think this is another area where in systematic reviews we're limited by what there is of primary evidence.
Thanks.
I'd just like to come in on this implementation point. So this review, I think, does actually a better job than most systematic reviews of really trying, getting additional reports where there exist on implementation. But it is a huge lack, and I think there is a gaping hole here in the sense that, you know, I think even researchers, it's not that they're opposed to putting implementation information in, but they're not necessarily sure on, you know, what should they put in, right? I actually think there would be enormous value to some standardized instruments that were put together that researchers could use. And so, okay, if I'm doing an input provision program, well, what kind of data should I record and put it in the online annex of my paper that says about the quality of implementation? Because otherwise it's just flying by night, and whatever strikes the fancy as important about implementation to one researcher or another. Because sometimes it's also difficult to distinguish between a good idea implemented badly. A lot of times the fact that it can't be, the fact that it can't be implemented well in a context is an indication that it's a bad idea in that context, even though theoretically it might make sense. So I think we need systematic data on that, and so hopefully someone in this room will prepare that standardized instrument.
Just one addition on the point about the small effect sizes. I think it's quite difficult to compare effect sizes between education and, let's say, other sectors. And even within education, you're using a lot of different kinds of tests. Let's say the outcome is a test score. You're using a lot of different kinds of tests. And it's not necessarily straightforward to say that even 0.2 is a large or a small effect. It depends on the population that the test is administered to and what the test itself is. And I just checked, in fact, if Britain's PISA test score in maths was increased by 0.2 standard deviations, it would be higher than Japan's. So, I mean, that would be a large change.
Just a very short comment. I mean, it's interesting to have colleagues working on the GEC program here, because I think that was an attempt, and you know, we have practitioners there who are feeling the pain, I know that, but it was an attempt at the time to really bring together programming and robust evaluation at the same time to really inform decision making in a live process. So I think, you know, I mean, there are some lesson learning around it, but I do think, you know, 15% of the whole overall budget, which was a massive budget for the GEC, was dedicated to evaluation, and that's, you know, that it was quite a brave step by the department at the time. So, I mean, you know, there is lesson learning, but I do think that we need to move that forward in terms of our programming if we really are going to invest wisely. And just to say, Pauline's example is an example of an NGO and a research institution working together. So there is already practice going on in that field.
Great. So another round of comments. So over here, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Judith Bennett, Hydrogen from Medicine. You emphasise the use of mother tongue in trying to understand some of the variation in results. I'm just surprised that mother tongue as an intervention, teaching the mother tongue, wasn't actually on the list.
Thank you. Most of the credit for this year Institute of Education, Caine Rolleston, President. Listening to this before, and I've been very listening to it today. 2 questions. Could you unpack what you really mean by the context? There are country fixed effects in cases where they do work and not an effects. You find it, of course, in your studies, because there could be some country fixed effects, maybe because of their national histories, standard evolving over time, those affect this kind of review. The second question related to that is, most of the studies tend to look for low-performing schools, low-performing regions. In a broken system, some parts of it are working. Are there studies of this data that look into this broken system? Which parts of this broken systems are working? And how can we understand those that are working and to those that don't work? Is that something this kind of study?
Thank you. My name is Anita Ntekema from the Open Society Foundation. As you mentioned already, the importance of the Education Commission report that just recently came out. And one of the interventions they found that had a large impact on both learning outcomes, on equity, and was a very cost-effective intervention was having access to pre-primary education and the effect that had on learning outcomes further up the chain. So I just wondered if there was a reason why that might not have been included as one of the education programs to look at and see the impact that might have on learning outcomes. And connected with that was the strong message from the report about the importance of mother tongue literacy and mother tongue education as well. So I just wondered what the reasons might have been for not including that.
My question or my comment is addressed perhaps what they did in this report. It's not so much about the systematic review. It is maybe just to give a word of alarm, which I would rather reticent to do in such a distinguished audience here, about the real crisis of a system which in West Africa, and I travel around, has hugely increased enrollment. Quality has descended enormously. Dropout rates are huge. So out of 300,000 enrolled in first primary, maybe 30,000 will end at the end of secondary, with very few employment prospects. So and which is costing 20 to 25% of the government budget. It is a complete blockage, and what I can see, evaluators and the UNESCO reports and so on are timidly touching upon it, but it is an enormous crisis that has to be really top of model, it's not affordable, it's not relevant to the societies, and in addition, it's really good education. So, you know, we got a huge crisis out of the report.
Arshima, I'm a researcher and activist from India. So I travel in the villages and I find hundreds and hundreds of unemployed youth who have completed secondary education, some have BA degrees, extremely intelligent people, but the jobs are just not available. And the kind of education that's provided by the system doesn't allow them to then progress in the system beyond a certain point. And I've met families, for instance, who do not want to send their children to school for valid reasons, because their children end up aspiring to become something that they cannot realistically achieve, and in the process leave the land. And so, you know, with the global food crisis that we have, will then be sort of even more in crisis. So I wanted to ask about the kind of crisis that we have in education, and whether you could kind of address the idea of aspiration and unfeasible aspirations. Thank you.
Okay, that's a very broad question, which maybe I'll leave to some of our policymakers here. But let's first turn it over to Birte for some of the more specific questions on the report itself.
The question about mother tongue. So I'm not entirely sure about the specific studies included in the Commission's report, but I think possibly one issue is a matter of how we classify different programs. So some of the programs that we include and label as structured pedagogy might actually have been labelled as something else by others. I'm fairly certain that if there was we didn't exclude programs that were focusing on teaching in children's mother language, and we do have some programs to do that, but that's not what we call them. I think there was a question about pre-primary. So that we didn't look at pre-primary education, and I agree that that's an important area. There are a couple of reviews that have looked at that, but I'm not sure if it's been comprehensively reviewed. Maybe David knows better. In terms of so the issue with context. So I guess one of the reasons why. So we don't find any kind of clear element of context that's kind of repeated across the program areas in the review. We do see that for many intervention areas, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the results. So programs work in some contexts, but not in others. And for some areas, we have enough studies to try and identify what elements of context or other factors it might be that are driving those results. So I don't think that there aren't any kind of one element of context. But so when we say that there is a need to tailor programs to the specific context, it's because of this need to actually address the barriers. So say for example for school feeding programs, we see that they in contexts where you don't have an issue of with school attendance and malnutrition is not an issue, these programs do not seem to make much of a difference, whereas in contexts where these are challenges, they do. So it's important before we design intervention strategies to identify what are the main challenges in a specific context, and then design strategies to address those challenges.
Can I ask the others too, and especially some of these more general questions that are coming up on outcomes related to employment and also the West Africa challenge. Dave, there were some questions for you.
Hard to say. So I think just the point on the early child development stuff, there have been a few good reviews recently. One very recent one came out of the independent evaluation group that Manny used to lead. And at the World Bank, I'm glad that it was separated out in the sense, because I think there actually tends to be an overemphasis on academic outcomes of early child development programs. And so where I think most of the gains that we see are actually far longer reaching than the cognitive sort of short-term outcomes, some of which seem to dissipate. I think, so in the World Development Report, we're definitely tackling this issue of what many have termed the learning crisis. It's a huge issue, and unsuitable education. And I think which feeds into this comment that you made about the link, the link to industry, and the challenge that countries have to grapple with, essentially, of a lot of countries, the vocational kind of training, that might lead people in. They're incredibly expensive and they get outdated almost as soon as they're created, when they are created well. And so I think there's an ongoing challenge to figure out how to deliver education in a way that students can learn how to learn how to create their own jobs. In a lot of countries, people will end up being entrepreneurs anyway, and so equipping them with the skills for that. We have some evidence on that, which we'll be digging into in the World Development Report, but there's definitely still a lot to learn there.
Sally, any last comments from your side on any of the things that have been said?
I mean, I think really just to add to this transitions issue, which I think is really important, and certainly we're very aware of in terms of our education work. But I think that there is a really important gender story in that, though, David, which I hope will come out really strongly in your report, because that, the sort of the different life chances, the different transitions for girls and boys in different contexts is really important to bring out. So that's all I want to add to the very useful interventions. Thank you.
And a point about the broader evidence and where systematic reviews fit. Of course, systematic reviews tend to favour studies which have a particular kind of design, i.e. those which are focused on causal analysis, particularly randomised control trial. And it may be that certain types of interventions at the system level, as Matthew pointed out, aren't amenable to that so easily. And something like mother tongue education tends to be administered in a whole region or a whole country, and not on an experimental basis where it could be very controversial. Not that there haven't been experiments, but there are probably not a huge number that you can include in the review. And that's obviously an issue for the evidence more generally. How do you combine the evidence that comes from systematic reviews or randomized control trials with other forms of evidence which are not generated experimentally? And I think that, again, is something we need to make more effort to do.
Yeah, just 2 points on that. I think they're excellent point. But I think that we're also finding is that the results of reviews like this might be very useful inputs into the kind of theorizing and modeling that you might do to look at overall system effects. And we've seen those as well. And also in some of the studies that the team looked at, there were different combinations of inputs that were also systemic in nature that I think might be useful to inform the debate about systems. Birte, do you have any last points that you want to make as the lead author of this report?
I'm not sure. Well, I really hope that the report will be used to inform decisions, and I really hope that we will see the investment in research that we need to be able to address the learning crisis. Yeah.
Well, Thank you, and thank you all. It's been a very incredibly rich discussion this evening. I think that someone mentioned we shouldn't underestimate the challenge that is ahead of the whole world in addressing the learning crisis. And I look to Dave and his report here to not to resolve that perhaps, but to make some headway with some of the inputs that are being made. No, but it is a challenge not just for him, but it is a challenge for everyone. And I think what we've heard this afternoon is that that can't be underestimated, and that more work is needed. The other takeaway that I have is that I do think that the point that was raised by all of our speakers here, that we really need to have to use this report, even though it is quite finished, as a raw material that will be combined with a lot of other things when it's applied. People talked about context and the need to make this bespoke to the local side. And that's a challenge not just for the research team, but it's a challenge for research teams to work with implementers together, as some of our panelists pointed out, to make sure that these are applied well for the future. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, but also